Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kalina Shukarova-Savovska, and I'm a Senior Financial Management Specialist with the WorldBank Center for Financial Reporting Reform here in Vienna, Austria. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this distance learning event with a focus on the new International Professional Practices Framework update. Arman Vatyan, a financial management sector leader for Central Asia, Europe and Central Asia, Public Sector Accounting Window Manager from the World Bank and also leader of the PEMPAL EACOP, is joining us from Yerevan. Here in Vienna with me is Piotr Pizziak, who is also a familiar face from the Internal Audit TOT program, and he will be also joining us during this virtual learning event. This event is organized under the Strengthening Accountability and the Fiduciary Environment, SAFE Trust Fund, and is made possible by the generous financial support of the Swiss Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO, and the European Commission, with the aim of improving public financial management in the Europe and Central Asia region. The International Professional Practices Framework, IPPF, as a conceptual framework that organizes authoritative guidance for internal audit practitioners, was revamped by the Institute of Internal Auditors during July 2015. Additional changes to the IPPF and the international standards for professional practice of internal auditing came into effect during 2007. These changes include enhancements to existing standards on communications and quality assurance, creations of 2 new standards that address roles of internal audit functions and objectivity in both assurance and consulting engagement, an alignment of the existing standards to a set of core principles that were incorporated into the IPPF. These changes are relevant for auditors from both private and public sectors and are implemented in order to help internal auditors meet the demands created by an evolving and dynamic organizational environment. This virtual session will re-emphasize the importance of the various components of the IPPF and discuss the main changes to the IPPF and the standards that are relevant for Central Harmonization Unit staff, heads of internal audit units, and public sector internal auditors. I have a pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today. We have with us Jan-Pierre Garitte. Jean-Pierre is an international governance, risk management, and internal audit practitioner and consultant and trainer with 40 years experience. His rich experience in the field includes many roles, amongst which Director of Internal Audit at J. Van Breda and Company for over 20 years, and partner with Deloitte Enterprise Risk Services, where he led the corporate governance, internal audit and risk management practices in Europe, Middle East and Africa regions. Jean-Pierre has undertaken numerous quality assessments of internal audit functions on behalf of the Institute of Internal Auditors, the World Bank and the OECD and the European Commission also. He is a professor at the Antwerp Management School and visiting professor at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam and South Bank University in London. Jean-Pierre has been advising board of directors and audit committees across Europe and Asia and is the chairman of the Audit and Oversight Committee of the International Organization for Migration in Geneva. Currently, Jean-Pierre is a member of the European Commission's Audit Progress Committee. We will have an opportunity to hear from Jean-Pierre in a few minutes. Before we do so, let me provide a few technical notes. Participants are joining us either via WebEx connection or through VC connection with the following venues: Tirana, Sarajevo, Pristina, Skopje, Podgorica, and Ankara and Belgrade. The VC connections with Vienna is also available. Arman is joining us from Yerevan. In order to have a successful session, I would like to kindly ask all sides to make sure that the microphones are turned off while not speaking. Participants who are joining via WebEx should make sure that the mute button is on. In case a site is dropped during the session, please redial to join if you're joining us through WebEx, or seek IT support at your WorldBank venue if you're joining us through VC. Now let me pass over to Jean-Pierre for his presentation that will be followed by a moderated Q&A led by Arman. Jean-Pierre, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kalina, and welcome everybody to this webinar on the update of the International Professional Practices Framework for Internal Audit, or as we will use it by its acronym, the IPPF. So from time to time throughout the presentation, you will hear me saying next slide. And of course, this is a hint to Kalina, who has the master view of this webinar. So next slide, please, Kalina. So it is important that when we talk about the IPPF and about its components, and that we refer all of that to the existing framework that has been promulgated for many years and updated by the only professional body for internal auditors, the worldwide body, the global body, which is the Institute of Internal Auditors. So although the IPPF itself and the components are of course copyright protected, it is the purpose and the aim of the IAA to spread the word and the content, the practice, the knowledge throughout the world, not only to ourselves as practitioners, but also to the people that we serve, to our stakeholders. So many of you are familiar with this picture here, which in a very compact way really represents what the IPPF is all about. So in the dark blue section, which is headed Mandatory Guidance, you will find all the components that are of a very strict mandatory nature for every practitioner of internal auditing. In the below section, in the gray area, you will find the recommended guidance. So recommended guidance relates to good practices, but it is, let's say, at another level compared to the mandatory guidance. What is also new is all around this framework, you will see in the marine blue section, the mission statement, which is also pretty new. Now, next slide, please. If we compare it with the past, you may still be familiar with the other logo there about the IPPF. So inside the circles, you will see that the IAA didn't touch about the definition, didn't touch the international standards, and didn't touch the Code of Ethics when they migrated or updated the IPPF from the version of 2015 to the version that we know since 2015. What has changed, that's in the gray area below, you see that the recommended guidance, instead of 3 components, the position papers, the practice advisories, and the practice guidance, we are now limited to 2 components, which is the implementation guidance and the supplemented guidance. The implementation guidance totally replaces the practice advisories. And you see that in the triangle there, they refer directly to the standards. So this is in fact the guidance that will help people on how to implement particular standards into their environment. Now, over the years, some components, some elements of these practice advisories, they became so natural that in fact there was no other way around to interpret the standards. And what the IAA has done is to move these logical components of the practice advisories to the standards themselves, but in a section that didn't exist before 2015, and which is called the interpretation. And so we will see that later on when we talk about the standards. There is always a statement, but very often there is also an interpretation. Now, you may say this is just, let's say, a move from one section to the other. Yes, but we were moving from the gray area, non-mandatory recommended guidance, to the blue area, which is the mandatory guidance. So next slide, please. So what does the IPPF represent? First of all, it is an authoritative professional guidance. So it is under the authority of the Institute of Internal Auditors, representing the profession worldwide, and which helps internal audit and also their clients, their stakeholders, on how to perform successful, effective audits. Now, you may say, what is the authority of the Institute of Internal Auditors to provide that guidance? Now, because the Institute, in fact, is represented by practitioners, by internal auditors with a lot of experience, but it is crucial, in fact, to listen to our stakeholders. And this is what the IAA does on a periodical basis. On a periodical basis, the IAA will launch a survey, an academic survey, whereby they will listen to the voice of our stakeholders. Our stakeholders being members of the audit committee, being members of a supervisory board, being members of a board of directors, but also to senior management. And this is what in the second line you will find under CBOK, it's the common body of knowledge. And this is why from time to time you will see that there are changes to the standards, and not only to the standards, that there are changes to the training programs for internal auditors as well, that there are changes to the certification programs like the CIA and the CGAP programs. And ultimately, the IPPF contains all the essential elements and that are needed for internal auditors to effectively deliver their internal audit services. Next slide, please. Now, the Institute of Internal Auditors also integrated, in fact, another safeguard into our system of the IPPF. And they created a few years ago a council, a supervisory council. And in that council, you will find representatives, in fact, of global organizations like IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants. And now you may ask yourself, why do the accountants, in fact, need to monitor or to influence eventually our standards? It is because the accountants represent the external auditors. And the external auditors are... So the IFAC, the external accountants, they are also representing the council. Why? Because the external auditors, not sufficiently still, but very often rely on the work of internal auditors. And in order to rely on the work of internal auditors, they also have to be sure about the methodology, the professional standards that are driving our professional services. The second organization there, and that's maybe a little bit North American oriented, is the National Association of Corporate Directors. So these people, in fact, represent part of our stakeholders. Because as internal auditors, we have a dual reporting relationship. We report to senior management, but we also report to an independent body, being a board of directors, a supervisory board, an audit committee. I know that this is not always the case in the public sector, not yet. So, but these are in fact also part of our stakeholders, an important component of our stakeholders. So they are represented as well. And then we have for the public sector, the INTUSI, the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institution, and the audit chamber, the Cour des Comptes. So they also will rely in the future much more on the work of internal audit, just like the external auditors. And then we have the OECD in Paris. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development will also try through these standards to influence or to help countries all over the world, I would say developing countries, in fact, to implement the sound principles of internal audit. And of course, there is the Institute of Internal Auditors who has a voice in it, but also the World Bank, because the World Bank and the OECD, they sometimes do have, let's say, parallel interest in helping countries to evolve in the right direction. Next slide, please. So again, now let's go back to the IPPF itself. So in the mandatory guidance, we used to have only a few components. Now we have 5 components. The mission is all around it. We do have, and this is very critical, and we will elaborate a little bit further on that, the 10 core principles of internal audit. Then, as I said before, definition, standards, and code of ethics didn't change since 2015. And then we do have the recommended guidance, as I said, consisting of implementation guidance, which replaced the previous practice advisories, and supplemental guidance, which can be almost anything, a good handbook. The IAA also has a series on practice guides, for instance, how to audit HR, how to audit IT security. All of these guidance, in fact, they are part of this category. Next slide, please. So new in 2015 was the mission. So we realized, in fact, that throughout our years of existence, we never thought about having a real mission for internal audit. And that mission, in fact, articulates what we try to achieve within our organization. What is our role in the organization? And sometimes you may say, yes, do we have a role? And management is often questioning us about it. And so here we can say our role is here to enhance and to improve and to protect the value of the organization. And how do we do that? Because we are not part of management. We do that by providing assurance. And that assurance is risk-based, it is objective. But we also provide advice and insight. Now, enhance and protect organizational value. The protection of organizational value is something that we have always done over time, but the enhancement maybe not. And the enhancement is really linked to insight. It is looking at the future, not only providing an opinion about what happened in the past. Management, especially, is not that much interested in the past. Management is interested in the future. How can we survive? How can we create future value as an organization? And this is, in fact, also a part of our focus. Advice then relates to the consulting part of our services. Insight is maybe a little bit of a challenge for internal auditors. Why? Because it means that we really have to know more about the strategy, about the way to go for the organization. What do they want to achieve? But not only for our organization, we also need to have more insight about the competitors to our organization, about the economical environment, about the political environment. And so that's all, in fact, represented by that small little words insight. Next, please. Now, the core principles, in fact, I'm very happy that we as an Institute of Internal Auditors, and that we managed, in fact, to identify a list of 10. It's not many, but still there are a lot of principles here. And these principles you will find reflected in the IAA, and that's part of the update. The IAA has changed its standards to really articulate the words of these core principles. And not only in the standards, but you will find them in the Code of Ethics, and you will find them in a definition. In the definition and the Code of Ethics, we didn't change anything in 2017. But in the standards, we changed, in fact, a lot of the wording in order to reflect these core principles. Now, for me, these core principles are a lot easier, in fact, to start a discussion with senior management or with a board of directors or with an audit committee. While when a little bit later on we will look at our definition, the definition is very meaningful to us, but it is still, I found it very difficult, in fact, to explain to others. Next, please. So the very first 5 are on this slide here. So first of all, we have to demonstrate integrity. Now, integrity was always, in fact, part of the code of ethics, and it's still part of the code of ethics. But the verb demonstrate goes a little bit further. So it's not enough to be integer. We also have to demonstrate it to the others in the organization. It's just like when we talk about senior management, that they have to set the tone at the top. We have to set the tone like we are Mr. or Mrs. Integer in the organization. So that's what we really have to demonstrate. We also have to demonstrate competence. And competence is another principle that we will find next to integrity in the code of ethics. So it really means that we cannot undertake any single audit activity, surely not assurance, but also not a consulting activity, if we are lacking the skills, the expertise, the knowledge to perform this kind of services. So many auditors, they go quite easily over that principle, which is reflected in the standards. But due professional care means, it doesn't mean that we have to be unfailable, that we have to be perfect, but at least we should manage our services, our engagements in a way that any other professional would have done in similar circumstances. Now, it's very easy to say that before the fact, but usually due professional care is being evaluated, assessed after the fact. And very often it is being questioned in the case of a major incident in the organization, a major loss or a major fraud. And of course, when there is a major loss, when there is a major fraud, everybody will look at top management, at the president of the organization, at the director general. And that's where the director general will go into his or her drawer and say, but I have an audit report here that says that everything is under control. And so that's where we have to prove, in fact, that in performing the audit, we exercise due professional care, which will never eliminate everything, but we will have to prove it. People will question us, and others will try to protect themselves and point the finger at us. Where were the internal auditors, or where were the external auditors in order to identify that incident at an earlier stage? But we can come back to that a little bit later on. The third principle is that we have to be objective and free from undue influence. So that's our independence. Now, the objectivity, of course, all the 10 principles are the same, do have the same value, I mean. But if there is one principle that is of utmost importance, it is objectivity. We need to be objective. And you will see that objectivity is reflected in our mission statements. It is, of course, part of the core principles. It is mentioned in our definition. It is mentioned in the code of ethics, and it is mentioned in the standards. So that's why I say that really the IAA really wanted to emphasize that. Our independence means, okay, undue influence from anybody within the organization, especially from management. So, and in order to protect, to safeguard our independence, this is the reason that we have that dual reporting line to a separate independent body, the audit committee, the board of directors, or the supervisory board. The fourth principle is we have to align ourselves, or let's say the strategy of internal audit with the strategy and the objectives and the risks of the organization. Now, again, this sounds to be very easy, but that means that we need to have some inside information as well about the strategy of the organization. Where do we want to go to in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years? So, and only by knowing that, we can assess what are the potential risks for the organization. And very often when we make our risk assessment as internal auditors, we see that, yes, management will look at it and will say, yes, okay, I agree with your list of risks, but these are not my lists. Many years ago, we did an exercise. We sat together in a workshop with presidents of an organization and their head of internal audit. We had joint sessions, but we had separate sessions. And in the separate sessions, we asked, in fact, all of them to write down what are the 10 major risks of the organization. Then we brought the presidents and the heads of internal audit back in the same room, and we compared their risks. and out of the 10 risks, only 3 were the same. So that means that 70% of the risks were assessed or were identified in a different way by the president of the organization and the head of internal audits. And the main reason, and then I go back in fact to our mission statement, the main reason was about the past up to the present, and that's the view of internal audit, and the view of management from the present to the future. So management in fact really looks at future risks, while internal audit will look at risks from the past and extrapolates them to the future. And so we have to think about that when we talk about alignment. The fifth principle says that we need to be positioned in an appropriate way in the organization, and we need to have adequate resources. So when you look at the standards and at the interpretation, it says that we should report to the top function in the organization. What happens if we don't report to the top function, if we have to report to the number 2 in the organization? That doesn't mean that it is bad. It all depends, in fact, also on the interest and the time that the person to whom you report will have for the sake of internal audits. And so we always have to translate that inside the organization. When we talk about the adequate resources, it means that we have to look at the quantity. Can we do a lot with a one-man or one-woman internal audit shop in the organization? So this is about, let's say, the volume, the number of internal audit resources, but it also has a qualitative component, and that's about the knowledge, the specialization, the experience of the internal auditors. Next slide, please. The sixth principle talks about demonstration of quality and a continuous improvement of our quality. And so all of you will know that within the attribute standards, we have a number of standards that are dedicated to quality assurance and improvements. So as auditors, we are able to audit every component of what we call our audit universe, but of the organization. But we also have to be audited. We have to make self-assessments and we have to make external assessments. And so we really have to demonstrate that our stakeholders, in fact, receive the best services that they deserve. And we always have to raise the bar for ourselves. It's not because we provide quality services today that we will still, by doing the same thing, provide the same quality in 2 or 3 years of time. The seventh principle talks about communication. We have to communicate in an effective way. What does it mean effective? The fact that you produce audit reports is not necessarily the same as effective communication. Effective communication will result in the fact that management is doing something with your comments or with your recommendations. And so that will be the effectiveness. Then we have the eighth principle, which again is mentioned in our mission statement, but also in our definition. We provide risk-based assurance. Assurance, besides consulting, this is probably our main task, and it's risk-based. So it means that we will not audit what is easy to audit, but we will audit what needs to be audited. The ninth principle really focuses on the future. We have that inside knowledge, information. We are proactive in nature. So it means that we will not also wait until new processes are in place, but we will also be proactive. That means that we will assist management during the development of a process. And when I say assist management, it means assist with advice, that we can point out to management where there are some potential risks and what can be controls that management can put in place. So more in a proactive way. And we should be focused on the future as well. So that relates to the creation of the future value for the organization. And altogether, number 10, it means that all of these principles, if we respect them, that they will help the organization to improve itself. Next slide, please. The definition of internal audits is not something that we will elaborate here in detail. I still feel very proud about this definition because, in fact, the definition was developed in 1998 during my chairmanship of the global board of the Institute of Internal Auditors. It is a nice definition because every word, in fact, has really be balanced, whether it needs to be inside or outside of the definition. But it's not something that you will use when you gather together with your friends and family and they ask you, what kind of job are you doing? You will not explain internal audit to them by doing that. But for us, it is important. So, of course, this definition is known by all of you, but I would still want to emphasize that I say that every word is important, but maybe two small words are for me a little bit more important than the others. And this is on the second line, our activity is designed to add value. We have to bring value to the organization. And we have to constantly also prove that value to the organization and its stakeholder. And if you think about our future and our future chances of still exist within the organization, have a role to play when we look at our competitors, sometimes external competitors, but also internal competitors. Think about the risk management function, for instance. Risk management, in its name, it is management, and it has risk. It is the business of senior management. When you talk about internal audit, we have to realize that it doesn't always have a positive connotation in the eyes of senior management. Internal, it's like internal affairs, it's like a policing function, and audit is something who will look at the past. So our name is not always in favor. So we have to prove that value by our acts that we are doing throughout the organization. So next slide, please. The Code of Ethics is nothing changed to that. So this is also not new. It states mainly the principles with regard to the behavior of our department, but also the principles with regard to the behavior of the individual internal auditors. And when we talk about behavior, it is not limited to our professional behavior. It also expands to the behavior outside of the organization, how we conduct ourselves in, let's say, private environments. So because this may also have an impact on the way that we are being perceived through our auditees and to our stakeholders. Okay, next slide, please. So the Code of Ethics consists of 4 main principles, and all of these principles, so the ones that are relevant to our profession of internal audit, have been translated into rules of conduct. So again, these rules of conduct, they are not very detailed. They will not tell you specifically what to do or what not to do. The purpose of the Code of Ethics is to force internal auditors to think about some circumstances. For instance, can we accept a lunch from an auditee? Sometimes you will say yes, sometimes you will say no. I can say yes because it gives me an additional time within the agenda of the auditee where I can have a private conversation and get some more information about the area that I'm going to audit. On the other hand, I can say no, especially if I'm working on a very delicate compliance audit and we already assume that there are a lot of activities that are not in compliance with rules or with legislation. So in that case, I would rather say, no, I may not accept a lunch. So it all depends on the situation. And the Code of Ethics, in fact, forces internal auditors really to consider all of that. Next slide, please. So the 4 principles that are reflected in the Code of Ethics are integrity. So again, that was one of the core principles. The objectivity, that was one of the core principles. And then we see confidentiality, which was not exactly mentioned in the core principles. So, but as auditors, we do have, and our charter gives us, that almost unlimited access to information, to people, to assets. So we have to deal, in fact, with that knowledge in a very careful way. We will get, let's say, privileged access. So that means that if we copy part of the information, we also have to take care how we maintain that kind of information into our working papers. And of course, it may be that in some cases, the prosecutor's office or the police or the judge may ask us, in fact, to share some information in a criminal case. Of course, in that case, it's not a breach of confidentiality if we are being asked or summoned by the authorities to share that information with them. But in all other cases, we cannot do that. For instance, if I'm doing a payroll audit and I suddenly see that other managers in the organization have received a significant increase in their salary, I have that information because I'm auditing it. I cannot use that information to go myself to the president of the organization and to ask also for a comparable upgrade of my salary, because that would also be considered a breach in confidentiality. And then competency, the fourth one, was also one of the core principles. So we do need to apply and to possess the knowledge and the skills, experience that are needed to perform the audits that are planned. And again, if my audit team is a bit larger, it is easy, in fact, easier to have that competency in place. Because when we talk about competency, it is a departmental principle that has to be respected. So the skills and the knowledge do not have to be present in the person of every single auditor, but have to be present within the department. So next slide, please. So the purpose of the standards, and now we come to the standards, is really to guide the practicing internal auditors on how to comply with that mandatory component of the IPPF. It will also provide the framework for performing, in fact, better and more value-added internal auditing services. And then the number 3, but that's not, let's say, the principal one, but of course, it will also be the basis for the evaluation of the performance of internal audit. Did you comply with the mandatory components, especially the standards of the IPPF? And ultimately, and this is what you will always find within the principles of the IAA, and that everything that we do is also for the sake of the organization and will help the organization to improve. Next slide, please. The components of the standards are 3. So what we always have for every single standard is a statement. And a statement is in fact a very basic requirement, but it is a principle. So it means that you, as a practicing internal auditor, you should look behind that simple or basic statement, and you have to ask yourself what principle is behind it. And that will make it much easier for every one of us to comply with these principles. Then, as I said, we do have interpretations, not to every standards, but to a growing number of standards. Now, these interpretations, they came from the previous practice advisories, but they were so obvious that the IIA decided some years ago to integrate them not into the basic statement, but as a separate section within the standard called interpretation. So when you click on a standard, you will see the statement and you will see the interpretation. But when you click on the standard, it means that you are looking at the mandatory components of the IPPF. So it means that you do not only need to comply with the principal statement, number 1 here, but that you also need to comply with the interpretation. And number 3 is the glossary of terms. Now you may say, okay, a glossary of terms is like a dictionary. I can consult it whenever I have some doubts. No, it is important, in fact, to read it. What does the IAA, or better said, what do the standards, what do they consider to be a residual risk, an inherent risk when they talk about risk? The most important item in the glossary is probably the word board. So in the standards, you will never find any reference to an audit committee. Whatever supervisory body that they have in mind, they call it boards. Now, in some of our countries, we do have 2 boards. We have a supervisory board and we have a managing board. When the IAA in its standards talk about the boards, it's always that body inside the organization that is responsible for supervision. So it means the supervisory board, the audit committee, or the board of directors. The managing board in the standards is always represented by the term senior management. And so it is important also to consult that glossary. Next slide, please. In the standards, we do have two major categories, the attribute standards and the performance standards. The attribute standards are, in fact, the characteristics of internal audit units and the characteristics of individuals who are performing internal audit services. The performance standards, they relate to our work, to our activities, from the planning to the execution to the reporting and some other things. So that's what the performance standards are about. Now, you will find now and then another kind of category which is called implementation standards. So it's not exactly a third category, but it is a standard that will expand specifically on either an attribute or a performance standards, but will say in the case you are performing assurance services, this is mandatory, this is a must. In the case that you are performing consulting services, it may be something different. A good example is our standard on monitoring. So we are responsible, 2500, we are responsible to have a monitoring system in place to follow up what management is doing with our observations and with our recommendations. Now, the implementation standard there will say this standard is mandatory in the case of assurance services. So when we provide assurance services, it is our duty, in fact, to follow up what management is doing about it. In the case of consulting services, it is not mandatory. We provide advice to management, and it's up to them to see what they do with that, whether they follow our advice or not. But in the case of assurance, where we identify weaknesses in the control system of the organization, they have to take some action, taking into consideration that management also still has the freedom to say, we leave the risk as it is, because this is our responsibility. And of course, we still have, let's say, an escalation procedure in that case. Next slide, please. The attribute standards have four major categories: the purpose, authority, responsibility, our raison d'etre, our reason of existence for internal audit; independence and objectivity, that we found back also in the core principles; the proficiency, which relates a little bit to our competency, but an ongoing development of our proficiency; and then the due professional care; and then quite a number of standards and substandards dedicated to the quality program for internal audit, involving both internal assessment and independent external assessments. Next slide, please. When we look at the performance standards, there are more categories there. If we start at a level of 2200, that's where we plan our individual audit missions. 2300 we execute it, and 2400 we report it. And so these three standards are really the core of our activities. 2500, as I say, that's where we monitor from time to time whether due dates are respected by management to implement the changes that are needed. And 2600 says that in the case management says, yes, but we accept the risk as it is. If you find as internal audit that that risk is beyond the risk appetite of the organization, it is your duty still to undertake some actions, to talk once more with management, or to escalate the matter to the audit committee or to the supervisory board. The standard 2000 deals with the roles and responsibilities of the head of the internal audit activity. So it's about planning, it's about communication with senior management and with the board. It's about managing your resources, taking care of the fact that you need these adequate resources. And 2100 deals with the three principal domains in which we are operational as internal auditors. That means the domain of governance, the domain of risk management, and the domain of internal control. Next slide, please. So now we come to the changes to the standards, and yes, we can move one more, Kanina. So when we look at the characteristics of the major changes to the standards, And they have been a couple of new standards that were added to the IPPF. There have been some major changes to existing standards. And there have been other changes, mainly interpretation to existing standards. And we will elaborate on these first three characteristics. If we look at the other ones, number 6 is a clear wording. And so whenever the IA goes into an overall update of its standards, they will still consider some wording. And so when member says, you see, we have problems with this word, they will take the time, in fact, to elaborate on that and to propose a better and clearer wording. So, of course, after 2015, now I'm looking at number 5, when these core principles came into practice, the standards board, in fact, also had to align the standards with these core principles. It's not that they had to change these standards, but the core principles were not always that visible within the existing standards. And so this is what have changed. And now the adherence to the principles is also being emphasized in the quality assurance program. So it means that the core principles now were added in 2015 as a new component in the mandatory guidance. So it means that within the quality assurance reviews, both internal assessment and external assessment, the assessor, in fact, also will have to look at the principles. Another thing about principles is that they will not only look at whether the internal audit functions, units, are compliant with the letter of the standards, but they will look, in fact, whether internal audit is compliant with the spirit behind the standards. And so that's a very qualitative improvement, in fact, of the quality review of the internal audit activities. Next slide, please. When we look at the new standards, there are two. There is the standards 1112 that says that the chief audit executive may have some roles besides internal audit, and we will come back to that. And another one is 1130 A3. And so the A3 means when you see A or C, it means that it is an implementation standard. When you see an A, it means that it relates to assurance services. When it is a C, it relates to consulting services. And so here we have a third implementation standard with regard to assurance directly related to the main standard 1130. And that talks, in fact, about potential conflict of interest that may exist, where they say that internal audit may provide assurance services in an area where they had previously, last year, 2 years ago, performed consulting services, but with some precautions. Next slide, please. So this is a totally new standard, 1112. So it says that where the chief audit executive is expected to have roles outside the internal audit function, we need to have some safeguards in place to really limit impairments, threats to independence or objectivity. Now, of course, internal audit having other roles, it's not a preferred situation, but sometimes the organization may ask us to do so. The organization is rather small. We have 2-3 people inside internal audit. We don't have a risk management function where the organization says, can you not take on that role? Because for us as an organization, your duty as internal audit and the duty of a risk manager, it's so close to each other. So why to hire an extra person? Why can you not do that? Because in your audits, you look at risks and you look at controls. But even in large organizations, think about American Express, you will see that there the head of internal audit is called the Vice President Internal Audit and Risk Management. And underneath that Vice President, you will have 2 separate functions. But the head, in fact, will cover both of them. So here it's about safeguards on oversight, because we cannot be objective by auditing some activities that are part of our responsibilities. If, for instance, risk management is within our portfolio, we cannot independently and in an objective way audit that. So that's why we, in fact, have to ask the board to look for alternative ways in fact, to audit that specific additional responsibility. Next slide, please. So let's now look at it in a more graphical way. And so when we look at the 3 lines of defense model, so we are the ultimate third line of defense. Usually when we talk about additional functions, they come out of the second line of defense. It may be risk management and it may be a little bit of compliance. And so ideally, these are totally separate functions, but it may also be that we are being asked, in fact, to take care of that. I can give you an example. Kalina mentioned in the beginning that I have an experience of 20 years as the head of internal audit of a financial institution in Belgium. Now, in many of our reports, a recurring weakness was the absence of an IT security function. And management was prepared to spend a budget to that, but they were not prepared to follow my advice to make it an independent function, not falling under IT, but being part of the second line of defense, but in other words, reporting directly to senior management. And that was their difficulty, because they say it's IT security. These people will speak a language that we as senior managers do not understand. So that was the only problem why they were reluctant to implement it. And then in order to move forward, in fact, I then proposed to take IT security to create the function, but under the wings of internal audit for a period of 2 years. And after these 2 years, we will cut a tie. Meanwhile, management will have had the opportunity to learn how to talk to these people. But of course, we could, during these 2 years, not independently and objectively audit the IT security function. And that's where we asked external audits in their annual audits to have a closer look at IT security, which was then temporarily under the wings of internal audits. Is it the ideal situation according to the letter of the standards? No. But remember, in a definition, we talk about adding value. So what is best for the organization? To have the function in place, working well, or to say as auditors, we have to remain totally independent, so we cannot do that. And the organization would not move forward. So again, this is an example of individual cases where a decision has to be made. But here, now the standard says this is perfectly acceptable, but you need to find a safeguard, a protection on who is going to audit that activity that you combine with your regular audit activities. So next slide, please. By the way, the 3 lines of defense is also one of the position papers of the IIA that has, yes, recently disappeared, in fact, from the IPPF, but that is still very valid. And another position paper is this one in front of you, with the potential roles of internal audit with regard to risk management. And when you look at the left side there, the darker blue ones, these are the roles that we must play. We must audit the risk management process. We have to give assurance that risks are correctly evaluated by management. So this is really 100% our assurance role. Now, if we look at the total right side, at the gray area, these are the activities that we should never undertake. Why not? Because these are managerial activities. So like the very first one, setting the risk appetite. It's not up to us internal auditors to set the risk appetite. This is a managerial responsibility, and even it starts, in fact, at the level of the very top of the organization, of the board of directors. To provide managerial assurance on risk. No, this is the responsibility of the first line of defense. Every manager who is in charge of departmental activities should provide to his or her superior assurance about their process. So this is managerial assurance. Now the problem lies in the middle one. In the middle category, you have the light blue ones there. And this, if you look at the verbs, it's about coaching, about facilitation, about championship. These are all things that we can do. We can, for instance, coordinate enterprise risk management activities if there is no risk manager inside the organization to do that. It is harmless, it's facilitating, it's coordinating. But if at the end of the day, we are the only department, the only people who speak about risk and about risk mapping, etc. in the organization, then very soon, in fact, and now I'm going totally to the right, people may hold us or may think that we are accountable for risk management in the organization. So too much focus on the middle ones may lead to the perception that we are in fact the risk manager of the organization. And that should be avoided. Next one, please. Now we got to the second new standards, and that relates in fact to the impairment to independence or objectivity. Here on this slide, you will have the original standard, which didn't change at all because it was an A standard, so it means an implementation standard. And so this is the original one. If in fact objectivity is impaired in fact or appearance, and here I want to re-emphasize the word appearance, because we may believe as internal auditors that we are pretty objective, but that is not what matters. What matters is how we are being perceived by others in the organization. So objectivity, it's all about perception. So we have to think perception when we assess our objectivity. So let's now move to the other slide to look at the changes. So the first two implementation standards didn't change. They were there. In the first implementation standard, we say that if you move from an operational department to internal audit, that you have to respect a cooling off period of 1 year before you can audit that activity. Now, it's nice to have this as a standard, but we also have to be pragmatic. If you are the only or two single auditors and you move from one operational department to the other, for instance, from accounting, and you say, I have to wait 1 year before we can audit accounting, that's not manageable, that's not doable neither. And so what counts here is that when there is a potential threat to objectivity, we have to disclose that. That is important. Also, when you see here, within the 1 year, yesterday at the Audit Committee of the European Commission, we had a discussion about this because the Director General of Internal Audit took his precautions that he moved from the accounting office, where he was the accounting officer of the entire Commission, to the Director General of Internal Audit. And he says, during a period of 1 year, according to the standards, I am not allowed to sign any report or to be involved in the audit of accounting. And so he gave that mandate to somebody else to do that. Now here I asked him the question, what is the difference now between 360 days and 370 days, which is just below the 1 year or just above the 1 year? In fact, what you need to do is on a case by cases, you have to evaluate for yourself, can my objectivity be impaired or can it be perceived to be impaired by others? And then you have to take measures if possible. And if it's not possible, the least you have to do is to disclose it. The number 2 talks about the fact that if you are engaged in other activities, that these activities must be overseen by a party outside of internal audit. So, but new is the number 3. It says that when you performed consulting services some time ago, you may still, as internal audit, provide assurance services. Of course, under one condition, is that the nature of your consulting services did not or may not impair your objectivity, and that your objectivity, eventually, when you have a large enough team, that you can manage it by reassigning other resources to the internal audit engagement. So it all depends. If you had a major role to play within a task force leading to the development of a new IT project, it may be that your objectivity may be questioned. So again, you have to assess it. And this is what the standards aim to do. And they force you to think about it. It is not like a holy book where you can say it is yes or no. They force you to assess it for yourself. And that's your responsibility. This is part of your due professional care as well. Next slide, please. A major change to an existing standard is the standard 2050, which falls under the managerial responsibilities of the head of internal audit. It's about coordination and reliance. It's about coordination with other providers of assurance services. This standard always existed. What has changed now is that they added the word reliance. Next slide, please. So reliance, in fact, means that we should not only talk to external audit or talk to risk management or to compliance or to inspection in order not to duplicate each other's efforts, but we also have the opportunity to rely on the results of their work. Next slide, please. And so again, we go back to the 3 lines of defense models. And so we, as internal audit, as a 3rd line of defense, we can rely on the work that has been performed by some of the 2nd lines of defense, and that means less work for us. But in order to do that, we need to have some guarantees about the quality of the work performed by that specific 2nd line of defense. And in order to have that kind of a guarantee, we first will need to audit them. So hence the importance, in fact, to focus in your audits also on the work that is being performed by the 2nd line of defense. But it's not limited to the 2nd line of defense. We can also rely on the work performed by the 1st line of defense. For instance, the head of a unit, the head of a department in the 1st line of defense has made an assessment through a controlled self-assessment program about his or her activities, about the risks and about the controls. Now you can rely on the outcome of that work, but only if you have been able to make a judgment about the quality of the entire assessment program. But the same is valid when we look at the right. If we know that external audit has specifically undertaken an audit of some of the IT functions, we don't have to duplicate that. We can in fact look at their work and we can rely on the results of their work. But again, we have to be sure about their scope. What was the objective of their audit? What was the scope? It may be a little bit more difficult and challenging to obtain the working papers from the external auditors in order to make a judgment about the depth and the quality of the work that they have performed. So next slide, please. So here, what is totally new in this standard is the entire interpretation. So we may rely on the work of other assurance and consulting providers. And now by referring to the 3 lines of defense, I mainly looked at internal providers, but you may also rely on the work of external consultants, for instance, who have been called in by the organization to perform a certain work. But we should consider their competence, objectivity, their due care, etc. And we should not forget that if we rely on the results of their work, we still remain, as a chief audit executive, accountable for the final results and for the final opinions. We cannot say, no, our opinion was wrong because we relied on somebody else. It's our duty and our responsibility. But here specifically, now the IAA has issued a standard, or better say, they issued an interpretation to the standard whereby we can put reliance, but where we remain responsible for the final conclusion. Next slide, please. What are now the other changes to the existing standards? So these is a variety of changes. For instance, the reference to the mandatory guidance. In the past, it was mainly reference made to the definition, the code of ethics and the standards. So now we will have, in addition, reference to the core principles and to the mission statement. Disclosure of interference. So when somebody tries to interfere with our work, either with the planning or with the execution of our engagement, or with the way that we formulate our reports, I'm not talking about the shape of our report, but about the content of our report, we do have to disclose that. The conclusions and the reporting with regard to the external quality assessment, we will come back to each of them one by one. And also that the entire function of internal audit needs to be managed with insight. And also, as a manager of internal audit, we need to communicate from time to time with our stakeholders on our activities, what should be included as a minimum. And then lately, with regard to development of the objectives of our internal audit engagements, they added, in fact, in the interpretation, something about the criteria. So next slide, please. So this is, as I said, in addition to the code of ethics, the standards and the definition, they added the core principles. And we are being asked, in fact, also to discuss the mission statement and the mandatory elements of the IPPF with senior management and the board. Of course, you need to do that in a very practical way. You don't go to the same kind of presentation that you make to internal auditors. So here you can just have one slide and you discuss about the IPPF model, what is mandatory and what is included there. Of course, the IA also says that you need to have all of this in your charter. And I remember that I personally had a discussion with the president of the bank at that time. He says, you see, I respect you and I'm very willing to include that in the charter and to sign that. But he says, I have a problem because you want me to sign a charter that includes some components for which I'm totally not in control. Because tomorrow, your professional organization, the IA, they may decide to change some of the content of this mandatory guidance, and my signature is still there. And in fact, he had a point there when he said that. And so we also include in the charter that when there are, let's say, important changes to this mandatory guidance, that it is the responsibility of internal audit to inform both senior management and the board about these changes. Next slide, please. This is an existing standard, an implementation standard, that our internal audit activity must be free from interference. And when we talk about free from interference, it's mainly related to our planning or the scope, the performance of the work, and the communication of the results. So if there is that interpretation, and so in red, this is what has been added, we have to disclose it to the board. Here you don't say senior management. Why not senior management? Because they are usually the ones that will try to interfere. And this, in fact, accentuates the role of a board or the role of an audit committee. And they are primarily there to protect your independence. And if somebody tries to interfere with your planning or with your scope, with the execution or with your report, that's a major interference. And that's where really you need, in fact, the protection of that independent supervisory body to help you and to safeguard, in fact, your principle from that interference. Next slide, please. So here we move to the changes with regard to the external quality assessment of the internal audit function. So nothing has changed with regard to the statement itself. So it says at least once every 5 years, but it is a minimum. So it all depends on the situation. And there are organizations that will require that the external assessment to take place at least every 3 years. Some organizations may say, for instance, in the case that there is a new chairman of the supervisory board or a new chairman of the audit committee, they may ask for such an external quality assessment. Why? Because they say, I want to know what is the quality of internal audit before I take on that responsibility as a new chair of the supervisory board or as a new chair of the audit committee. Next slide, please. So here in the interpretation, some, let's say, sentences have been added, and I highlighted the most important one here in red. So there is no real detailed guidance on how an external assessment must take place. But here now they added, whatever in fact is the content of the external assessment, that assessor must issue a conclusion, an opinion, as to the compliance of the internal audit function with the code of ethics and the standards. So that's a minimum, these two components of the mandatory guidance of the IPPF. And then it says the external assessment may also include operational or strategic comments. So this is more, in fact, about the benchmarking, about the best practices of internal audit. But the opinion on the code of ethics and the standards, it is a must. And then in the very last sentence of the interpretation, they also added that as a chief audit executive, you should ask and encourage the board or the supervisory body to take oversight in that external assessment. And why? In order to reduce a perceived or potential conflict of interest. The reason is that as the head of internal audit, you will know somebody. It can be a professional relationship, it can be a friend, and you can invite that person to make an assessment of your function. But of course you say, we are friends, so let's stay friends. And and even if it is correct, people will know that you are related to that external assessor, and they may say, yes, of course, to audit the internal audit function, you may invite a friendly relationship in order to have a good report. So to avoid that, you can still invite your friend, but in fact, the supervision, the oversight of that external assessment process should be in the hands of the board or of the audit committee. Next slide, please. So here, the last standard on the quality program says that we have to communicate the results of the quality program both to senior management and the board. And that was the end of the statement before. Now they added to the statement that the disclosure, in fact, your communication should at least include the scope and the frequency of both your internal quality assessment as well as from your external quality assessment. Secondly, what were the qualifications and the independence of the assessor? Again, both the internal assessor as well as the external assessment, including potential conflicts of interest. So let's say that your external auditor is one of the big four companies, and you ask their specialists from internal audit or risk management to make the assessment of your internal audit function. This may represent a potential conflict of interest. And why? For instance, in the case that the external auditors are for many years relying on the work of internal audit, which may create a potential conflict of interest if suddenly they come to the conclusion that the quality of internal audit is in fact not as expected and was not as expected in the recent past. So it is not always the case. But you have to mention that in your communication to the board. The disclosure should also include the conclusions of the assessors, and especially the conclusion with regard to the compliance with the code of ethics and with regard to the standards. And then, just as for any other audits, what is the action plan that management, and here management is the chief audit executive, the head of the internal audit unit, what kind of corrective action is that head proposing? Next slide, please. Some changes with regard to the responsibilities of the internal audit manager, and only in the section of the interpretation. And so the statement was very simple. The chief audit executive must manage the internal audit in an effective way to ensure that it brings value to the organization. You remember these two small words out of our definition. The interpretation focuses on the adjective effectively, or the adverb effectively. And so it is effectively managed when, in fact, what you do is what you said in your charter. If what you do is in conformity with the standards. If what every single member does is in conformity with the code of ethics and the standards. And now they added a fourth bullet point that, in fact, as internal audit, you consider trends and emerging issues that could impact the organization. So here we are referring again to the word insight. And that insight we found in the mission of internal audit, and we also found insight in the 10 core principles. So, and then in the last paragraph of the interpretation, they also added the words that you add value to the organization and its stakeholders when you, as internal audit, you consider their strategies, their objectives, and the risks that are inherent to the organization. And so all of these elements, these changes, in fact, they reflect what was incorporated into these 10 core principles. Next slide, please. So one of the duties of the head of internal audit is also to report periodically to senior management and the board. Here we are not talking about our regular audit reports that are related to an audit engagement. Here we are more talking to what we call our activity reports. Now the activity reports, there is no guidance from the IAA that says you have to report on your activities every month, every 2 months, 3 months, or once in a year. It all depends what the organization expects from you. How often do they want to get a message from you on, for instance, how far you are with the execution of your audit plan? So here, this standard and its interpretation have not been affected, and they exist for a longer period. But now we will go to the next slide, and we will see some additional changes in the interpretation. So here, what the IA has done is that they have said there is a minimum that we expect to see in that activity report. First of all, are there any changes that are needed to the audit charter? And the audit charter is a basic document, but especially with regard to the changing environment of the organization, with regard to the changes in legislation, with regard to changes in standards, we may have to update our charter. We have to make a statement on the independence of ourselves. Has somebody tried to interfere with our planning, our execution of our work, or our report? How far are we with the progress with regard to the performance of audit activities according to our plan? What about our resources? Are we short of resources? Which kind of resources do we need? And even if they said no to you some time ago, when you present your new activity report, you still mention we are short of resources. In our audit committee or in our meeting of this date, you say no, but the need is still there. What are the major results of your audit activities? For instance, you have seen some trends, some breaches with regard to IT security, with access rights, etc., that people, for instance, tend to share their passwords with others. If you see that appearing in more than one audit report, you can include that as a general, in fact, finding or observation in your activity report as well. Your compliance with the Code of Ethics and the standards. Now, you may say management may not care too much about it, but it's part of the contract of the charter that they signed together with you. Or in the case of a public sector internal audit, it may be very often part of the law and part of the regulation. So how are we with regard to compliance? And if there are non-compliance issues, what is our action plan in order to improve that towards the future? Are there any, let's say, responses from mainly middle management coming in where you say, as the head of internal audit, they have taken a decision, in fact, which is unacceptable or unmatchable with the risk appetite of the organization? Again, I say risk appetite of the organization, not the risk appetite as we determine it as internal audit, because this is a managerial responsibility. And all components, in fact, of the standards, they reflect, they relate, in fact, to the contents here of your activity report with senior management and with the board. Then the last comments here with regard to objectives and resources. On the next slide, please. So here again, we are talking about an implementation standard on engagement objectives. The statement itself, nothing changed. So that means that when we are performing an audit, what we do, in fact, is to assess whether people are working according to certain procedures. We will call them criteria. Now, there are different types of criteria. Very often you have internal criteria, which may be policies or procedures of the organization. So these are the procedures of the organization itself. So you are measuring, you are assessing what people are doing against their own procedure. You may have external criteria, for instance, laws and regulations, and that were imposed by statutory bodies. We don't have a choice. We have to comply with them. Now, usually they are already translated into internal criteria, but sometimes they may not. So these are two obvious criteria. The third one is already a little bit more difficult, leading practices. And we are not saying here best practices, because it's very difficult as internal audit to compare with best practices, because when you do that, there is an underlying message that says that you as an auditee, you are apparently not applying best practices. So we have to be very delicate in using that term. But when the IA refers here to leading practices, for instance, we talk about the COSO concept on internal control, or the COSO ERM concept, or the ISO 31000 concept on risk management, or others. These are leading practices, these are leading frameworks across the world. So that's part here of the interpretation. And then the very last one, the next slide, please, with regard to the allocation of resources for the engagement. That interpretation is not totally new because, as you know, in the category of 2000 management of the internal audit function, there is also a substandard on the allocation of resources. But that is the allocation of resources comparing to your audit plan. And exactly that interpretation was there as well. But it was probably in the past forgotten to put that here under the engagement resource allocation as well. So when we talk in the statement about appropriate and sufficient resources, appropriate refers to the quality. And that means that do we have the necessary skills, knowledge, and experience within the team that will perform the audit. And sufficient refers to the number of resources that we need to achieve or to accomplish the engagement in the due time frame before the deadline, but, and the last words are important here, still with due professional care. So next slide, please. So this brings us, in fact, to the end of the very short presentation, and of course we can elaborate for many more hours on specific words, etc., that have been used. But these were the major changes to the standards. And I took, in fact, the opportunity to go back a little bit and to start with the IPPF itself and with its mandatory components. Why was it important, especially the core principles? Because many of the changes were really driven by these 10 core principles. Some were already there, but maybe not that visible, and others were not present at all. And that's why we had also some new standards and some changes, major changes to existing ones. So Kalina, I give the floor back to you and to Arman.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. Let me check if Arman is with us. And in case he is, I will hand over to Arman for a moderated Q&A.
Thank you, Kalina. Thank you, Jean-Pierre, for a very interesting presentation. I would like to open the floor for questions. You will need just to unmute your microphone and give a question. Who is coming first? While we expect questions, I have one question, Jean-Pierre, to you. I have actually two questions. One is that the IPPF now differentiates between mandatory guidance and recommended guidance. So what happens if the internal auditor or internal audit unit, they do not perform internal audit services in line with the mandatory or the recommended components of the IPPF?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a good question, Arman. Thank you very much. Now here, first of all, we have to realize that the Institute of Internal Auditors doesn't have the same strength and authority as, for instance, the National Institutes for External Audits. Because the National Institutes for External Auditing, they give licenses to external auditors. They will exercise a quality control. And if you don't, let's say, comply with the basic standards and the basic principles, they can take away your license. And as an external auditor, you need your license to operate. Now here, the Institute of Internal Auditors, they also issue their certification programs, certified internal auditors, certified government auditing professional, and some others. Now here, as part of this certification, there is in fact a very heavy relationship mainly to the code of ethics and the standards. If you do not comply with the code of ethics, and if you do not comply with the major standards, automatically you don't comply with the code of ethics, that certificate can be taken away from you. Now, when the certificate is taken away from you, it's for life. You can never get it back. If, for instance, during your examination period, when you prepare for the CIA or CGAP exam, and somebody can prove that you are not, let's say, complying with the code of ethics, you may even be denied the right to sit for the exam. And not only once, but again, for life. Now, people may say, why do I need that license? It's my employer who decides. In the private sector, yes, it's a prerogative of senior management and the audit committee or the board to say, we employ you as an internal auditor. Whether you are an experienced internal auditor or a lousy internal auditor, that's their responsibility. They can still decide to put you in that position. For the public sector, it's a little bit different. Why? Because the law on internal audit is usually in existence in most of our countries. And that law on internal audit, that refers to the standards and to the code of ethics. Of course, it may refer to an older version of the standards and the code of ethics. But in other words, it means that if you do not comply with the standards or the code of ethics and with the mandatory components, you do not comply with your own local legislation. And this may have an impact on you. So the private sector, purely said, there is no guarantee that it may prevent, let's say, internal auditors who do not deserve that term, that title, to perform these activities. But in the public sector and those in the private sector who are certified, there is a protection mechanism.
Thank you, Jan-Pierre, and it was very interesting to learn how robust and strict are the requirements of the Institute of Internal Auditors. I will come with my second question, then open up again for the floor for questions. The mission statement, the core principles, definition, and the standards now refer to the assurance provided by the internal audit services. Assurance seems to be a very strong word. Is it realistic for the internal audit or internal audit services to provide assurance?
Again, Arman, you are asking difficult questions, but interesting questions. And in fact, now that you mention it, I should have elaborated a little bit on that, on the word assurance, because it's like due professional care. Internal auditors, they take it easily for granted that when they perform an audit and they issue an audit report, that they provide assurance. But very often when you read audit reports, you see that they highlight their findings, their observations, and they make recommendations. But this is not providing assurance. Providing assurance is, at the end of your audit, you provide an opinion and you say, we are in control of this operation or of this process, or we are not in control. This is assurance. It can be positive assurance and it can be negative assurance. But that means that people will look at our expression. And if you give negative assurance, immediately some people will jump at you and say, no, this is not true because we have this and this in place you didn't notice. So this can be corrected, although it's not good for internal audit, but this can be corrected. But let's imagine that you give positive assurance and a local manager knows that, they didn't see this. They say everything is under control, but in fact it's not. Who is going to complain about it? Nobody, unless something happens next year, in 2 years. And then there will be somebody at the top who opens his drawer and says, I have here a report where you give me assurance that everything is under control. So this is probably also one of the reasons why internal auditors are a bit reluctant, in fact, to come up with that strong message. But in fact, that strong message is what is expected according to the standards. And it's never, let's not forget, it's never absolute assurance. It's reasonable assurance.
Thank you for the elaboration on the reasonable assurance. I would like to open back to the questions. Please, participants, if you have questions, you need just unmute your microphone. Questions, please. Who is coming first? Jean-Pierre, I have another question regarding, you just referred to the due professional care. Both the core principles and standards refer to the due professional care. What exactly due professional care means, and particularly in the public sector context? Can you elaborate, please?
Yeah, due professional care, those of the participants who understand a bit of French, many of our countries have been influenced by the Napoleon Code. A Napoleon Code, which is very often the basis of our current legislation. And in the Napoleon Code, there is an article that talks about bon père de famille, a good house father. How does a good house father operate? You do not have to specify this by saying rules, this is what you have to do. But somebody, and usually it will be a judge, will make an assessment at a point in time if there is a complaint towards you, whether you acted as a bon père de famille. Now, the same is valid with regard to the execution of our work. And it starts with the planning phase of an engagement. For instance, the IAA and its standards will say that we have to assess whether the process is vulnerable to fraud, to major errors, to errors of non-compliance, to waste as well, more and more, to environmental issues. So it means that we have to assess all of these risks. So if you can prove, and here again the importance of your working papers, if you can prove later on to somebody who is questioning you that you have thought about all of this, then you can say that yes, I exercise due professional care. It is not unfailability. Now, what is the other side, or what are the risks? Because there are risks for internal auditors here. If somebody can prove that you didn't exercise due professional care, and they can prove or they can indicate that due to that perceived lack of due professional care, there was a loss for the organization, or in the case of a financial institution, for the depositors, they may turn against you, and you may end up in jail as an auditor, not because you did something wrong, but because you didn't do something good enough. And okay, I know that in Tirana some people are participating as well, but I do have a very personal example a couple of years ago of the head of internal audit. Okay, it was called the head of inspection of the central bank in Albania, who went to jail. And what was the reason for that? A large sum of money disappeared from the vault, from the safe of the central bank, new dollar notes. I think it was around $7 million. And the prosecutor's office came to internal audit, look at the audit plan and say, how comes that I don't see that you are auditing, in fact, this activity on a more regular basis? For me, this is a lack of due professional care, and that person, the lady, went to jail for a while. So there we, at the Institute of Internal Auditors, we really had to talk to the journalists, in fact, about what is the role of internal audit and what is not the role of internal audit. But in my, Kalina mentioned the 40 years of experience, I have at least 5 examples of internal auditors who were either for a while in jail or were seriously at risk to go to jail or to have to pay a serious penalty.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, because this is particularly relevant for the public sector, as there are few control and inspection and oversight bodies which are keeping an eye on the good house father, as you indicate, as you worded that.
Yes, and the least penalty that you can have is that you lose your job.
Yes.
And this I have many more examples.
Yeah, thank you. just going back to the participants, to make sure that they manage to unmute and to participate. Ankara, do you have any specific question, please? Can you please unmute just to be sure that there is no question on your side?
Hello, do you hear me, Aman?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, Bora from Ankara. First, I want to say hello, Jan-Pierre.
Hello.
My question is not about the changes in the standard, but the part of the introduction of the international standard. In 2015 version, we had a sentence like this, let me read this. If the internal audit, if the standards are used in conjunction with requirements issued by the other authority bodies, internal audit communications may also cite the use of other requirements. As appropriate, in such a case, if inconsistencies exist between the standard and the other standards, internal auditors and internal audit activity must conform with the standard and may conform with the other requirements if such requirements are more restrictive. But in 2017, we see a sentence in the middle of this whole sentence that we add, if the internal audit activity indicates conformance with the standards and inconsistencies exist between the standards and other requirements, internal auditors and internal audit activity must conform with the standards. So should we understand that if the internal audit activity pass the internal quality assessments and also external quality assessments, then if it's meet with such dilemma, it should stand with the standards, and if he couldn't pass those quality assessments, what's the internal audit activity or the department should obey? The standards and the other requirements. That's my question.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. You see, you always have to assess first which standards or requirements are of the highest importance. And I mean highest, which are the ones that you definitely have to respect. For instance, if you talk about Turkish legislation is far above the internal auditing standards of the IA. So you first have to comply, in fact, with your own legislation. Now, in the case that compliance with your own legislation implies a non-compliance with the standard, this is acceptable. You only have to mention that in your communication with the board and with senior management, and you have to explain why not, and what you are doing about it in order still to respect a little bit the spirit behind the standards. And so there are situations where you cannot comply because it is not under your control. And this is why the standards, and maybe I should have emphasized that as well in the beginning again, the standards, they are of the principle comply or explain. So if you have a valid reason to explain why you cannot comply, this is acceptable. And that doesn't mean that you are in non-compliance. But for instance, you cannot say, I didn't comply with the full scope of my audit because I didn't have time. This is not a valid reason. But an existing local legislation or even an ordinance within the company or within the organization that is conflicting with the standard, they do have priority. So that is a valid reason for you not to comply with the standards.
Yes, I understand, Jean-Pierre. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to understand why IAA add these sentences, like the internal audit activity indicates conformance with the standards. And so before these sentences, I mean, in 2015 version, the other two things was the same, and I agree with you. But with this adding, it looks like if you just obey the standards wholly, I mean, internal quality assessments and external quality assessments, you are good to go, then you should obey the standards. But if you don't follow exactly the standards and code of ethics in the means of internal quality assessment and external quality assessment, maybe you can follow the other requirements. This sentence just confused me.
No,
this.
but that was in the 2015 version. Okay, I don't have it right in front of me, but as a basic principle, your national legislation has the absolute priority, and this can lead to, for instance, in your quality assessment, to a non-compliance, but it is a justifiable non-compliance, but it will still remain a non-compliance.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Other questions, please? Tirana? Sarajevo? Tirana?
Hello? Yes.
Yes.
Hello, Arman. Hello, Jean-Pierre.
Hello.
Tirana. I have a question regarding the first standard, which is Audit, regarding the involvement of internal auditors to the risk management process. We find this additional standard very useful, since in our public units, in most cases, the risk management process is still underdeveloped. And we would like to know in which specific areas would be the best way to involve internal auditors in this process in order to develop further the risk management process. This is my question. Thank you.
So what are, okay, if I can just reiterate the way that I understood your question, you want to know, can we do this or how to do this?
How to do this? Because can we do this? For us, it's it's a must. We should involve internal auditors. They are the right people to speed the development of this process. But on what aspects and in what fields?
No, I believe you should help management, because that's what you need to do, is how to develop the entire process, because we should not forget that the process of risk management starts at the top of the organization. So that means that they could delegate this to internal audit for a limited period of time, but not forever. They should also agree that they remain accountable and responsible for the risk management system and process. You are only facilitating the development of it. You are championing the development of it. And that's your contribution to the organization. But it doesn't take away their, let's say, obligation and authority to take care of that. So you should have a kind of a memorandum of understanding, a good agreement on that. So it is not an expansion of the role of internal audit. It is a mandate that you will take on your shoulder for a very limited period of time. Okay, that may be 2 years or 3 years, until it is fully working inside the organization.
Tiziana?
Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Okay. And we have time for one more question. The last question, who would like to go? Sarajevo, Pristina, Podgorica, Skopje.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Hello? Greetings from Podgorica. I would like to thank Jean-Pierre for interesting presentation. And we have a question regarding a role of internal audit regarding insight role. We would like about how should we plan time for insight in our strategic or annual plans, and we would like to know about form of reporting about insight services of internal audit.
Okay, thank you. Now, the insight is not an extra service. It's something that is expected from you to help you to provide better services to the organization. But in order for yourself to provide insight, it's in fact insight. It's like looking into a crystal ball, that you know a little bit how the organization will evolve, but also how the environment outside of the organization will evolve. So, for instance, in the case of Montenegro, how far are we in fact on our step towards a membership of the European Union, for instance. And on that way to the European Union, what are the critical risks that we may be facing as a country and as a public sector? And so this means that in your audit approach, you will consider what may happen or what will happen in the future. So it's not a kind of an extra service. If your government is planning to undertake some additional activities as a public sector, or to outsource, for instance, if I take the Belgium example, to outsource tax collection for the future, this is a major change, which will also imply different kinds of risks that we have to manage, or that we have to identify and to manage. This is insight. But this also means that the only additional work is that you may have to be present now and then at top meetings within the government, so that you know what are the pending decisions there. And so that will enable you, in fact, to exercise that insight when performing your services.
Montenegro?
But it means that you really have to insist on the C in the Chief Audit Executive, and that you have to claim your seat at the executive table as well. Not as a decision maker, but as a listener and somebody who can say, hey, but did you think about, it's an opportunity, but did you think about the risk as well?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. Thank you for very good, detailed, and excellent presentation, and very clear answers provided. I would like also to thank all the participants for your interest and active participation. The distance learning this event is recorded, and the recording will be available on our website in due course. Let me use this opportunity to advertise our upcoming advanced stream workshop of the internal audit training of trainers, a community of practice, which is scheduled in Vienna, in the joint Vienna Institute in the week commencing June 4th, 2018. Invitations will be emailed separately, and we as internal audit training of trainers team will welcoming you. We look forward to welcoming you in Vienna. Please also visit the CFRR homepage and the PEMPAL internal audit community of practice webpage, as you can find very relevant and a lot of information, including all those presentations from the face-to-face and our virtual meetings. And virtual meetings, it's also a good opportunity to meet many people which we will not have a chance to meet in PEMPAL or IATOT meetings. Thank you for all participants, and Jean-Pierre and Carlina. And I would like just to thank Carlina and Piotr for their very active design of this program, and to Carlina specifically for her idea to make this virtual program. Thank you to everybody, and goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arman. Goodbye to
Thank you.
everybody. See you soon in Vienna. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.